we might not actually be seeing fat oxidation of 1.7 to 2 grams per minute. You're saying in a GC contender, in the best cyclists on the planet, what is their maximum fat oxidation in grams per minute?
Well, what we're seeing here is normally in the 0.7, 0.8 grams per minute under normal. And we have done these experiments, although we haven't published them, but we have done a normal athlete, like category 2 or 3. They do under normal diet, not super high in carbohydrates, not super low, normal diet. And their fat oxidation, the fat max, it's let's say 0.4. Then they do 1 week of carbohydrate restriction or 2 weeks of carbohydrate restriction, and their fat max, it's 0.8. But at the same time, we see that the power output decreases at least 0.5 watts per kilogram, so about 30 to 40 watts. And also we see that the maximum heart rate decreases and the maximum lactate decreases. That said, this is more in if you will, a more acute situation.
I'll tell you this from my experience, Iñigo. When I began carbohydrate restriction, which was, I went on a ketogenic diet in May of 2011. The first 12 weeks were hell. I couldn't even imagine approaching my anaerobic fitness. So forget lactate threshold or anything like that. I couldn't even get to the same aerobic level. I still remember very clearly, November 2012, 18 months later, it came back and then some. What that suggested to me, and if I could go back in time and do anything different, I would have had muscle biopsies done all along the way. But it struck me at how long it took for that adaptation to take place. Now, I only stayed in that state for 3 years. So I'm long out of that state now. The only time I'm really in ketosis is around fasting. But it's always sort of piqued my curiosity what a very, very, very long-term state, ketogenic state, can do for everything outside of peak sprinting capacity. Because I don't think there's any dispute that peak sprinting capacity has to be glycolytic, and anything that impairs glycolytic function makes no sense. So there's such a debate about all of this stuff. I don't think it makes sense for someone trying to win the Tour de France to be on a ketogenic diet. It's just too glycolytic. Even though 96% of that race can be done below peak power output, the race is won and lost under peak conditions. So it makes no sense. But if you're training to win the Western States 100, you technically don't need to sprint ever. If you have a high enough threshold, so I still have that sort of point of view, but again, I'm very curious as to what those adaptations are and how long they take, because I don't think they're going to take place in a month.
You bring up a great point. I'm extremely curious about that as well, because I have never seen an athlete at the elite level adapting. And I'm going to tell you why in a second. But at the same time, I believe that it cannot be possible that thousands of people around the world who are getting into the ketogenic diet, it might be working for them and they're making it up. So I believe there's something there. At first, when these things come up, and I say, come on, man, give me a break. But then I say, there's so many people out there. There's got to be something.
Well, there's one other data point I'll add for you. When I was on a ketogenic diet and cycling voraciously, my capacity to consume carbohydrates was much higher than what people think of as a ketogenic diet for someone at rest. As a general rule, for somebody who's normal, about 50 grams of carbohydrates is the limit. Above that, you begin to suppress the production of beta-hydroxybutyrate. But I used to do lots of experiments, and at my most extreme, days when you'd have a 3-day period where you would do 100 miles each day for 3 consecutive days at very high output. So for me at the time, that might have been average power of 185 watts, normalized power of 240 watts for 7 hours on 3 consecutive days. When you're at that much demand, I was able to consume 600 grams of carbohydrates and stay in ketosis.
My goodness.
Now,
wow.
I think that's because I'd spent so long adapting. I don't think you can show up and go into ketosis and then a week later eat 600 grams. I mean, I was pushing as hard as I could to see how much of this can I consume. But so there's the other thing to keep in mind, which is at some point the body became flexible enough that I could break all the rules. I could have 200 grams of protein, 600 grams of carbohydrate, and still maintain beta-hydroxybutyrate levels above 2 to 3 millimolar. Because I think the machinery with which the BHB was made was, I'd had 2 years of, in fact, this would have been probably 3 years in. This is the summer of 13 maybe. So now I'd really been at it for quite a while. And again, biggest regret is not having that. There are lots of athletes out there that I think would be interesting to study. So that's something worth considering.
Sorry to interrupt. The thing what I haven't seen that adaptations in elite athletes is that they cannot afford it. You mentioned that it takes months to get there. You don't have months because you get dropped in the races. Your performance is very poor. Your contract is going to be trashed. They're not going to renew you, and you're going to feel like crap. Every single athlete who has tried to go, whether you call it like a ketogenic diet or carbohydrate restriction, while training and competing for an event, they fail. That's what I've seen in 25 years. And the reason probably is this, because they didn't have 1 year to say, hey, you're not going to race in 1 year. You're going to train very little. Your mission is to get adapted. That's not the way sports works. But what I see is if you restrict carbohydrates, we do blood analysis a lot. We do this metabolic testing in the laboratory. While these athletes are competing, we see right away there's a catabolic response. The body says, holy crap, what's going on here? I need to survive somehow. So you enter in an evolutionary survival mode. So obviously, yeah, your ketones production might increase. Your fat oxidation might increase as well. But your protein breakdown increases substantially as well. And we see this in the blood analysis. That's why you see muscle breakdown all the time.
Although, again, it's transient, which, again, speaks to, because if it wasn't transient, I mean, evolution would absolutely demand we preserve protein under long periods of nutrient deprivation, which, of course, is what the carbohydrate restriction is mimicking. But it's this time course that I think is very unusual. And you're right. There's no professional athlete that could take that chance. And again, we were talking about this earlier. It's like there are some people whose entire lives can be built around chat rooms and discussion boards where they can debate these things endlessly. Neither you nor I have the time for that. So I've largely stopped paying attention to this debate, truthfully. But it's always struck with me how long it took to adapt and the price I paid during that adaptation period.
If you were a professional athlete, you would be out of the job.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
And this is why I think that I have never seen that, because sooner or later, the athlete, they hit the wall. They just cannot finish races, or they just like, hey, what's going on here? And then that's when they have to go back. And we see this quite often. Athletes don't always listen to us. They always go to the blogs and see things, internet, or they find where the neighbor is telling them. And a lot of people try many diets. And the tendency now, and it was before also, was to restrict carbohydrates. And again, I really think that you can adapt because the human physiology is a wonderful machine. But do you have the time to adapt while you're a competitive athlete? That's what I have a lot of thoughts that I don't think so.
Yeah. And again, I think the discussion is interesting and academic. But of course, in the end, I still think carbohydrate restriction is a great tool for anyone who's not trying to win the Tour de France. I think that's where people sometimes get hung up, right? It's if you want to win an Olympic gold medal, there are very few sports in which you could probably do that on a ketogenic diet. And if you want to be the best cyclist or runner or swimmer on the planet, very hard to do that on a ketogenic diet. The good news is, by the way, if you're at that level, your mitochondria are so remarkable that your carbohydrate tolerance is unbelievable. Where it comes back to, and I think where the biggest opportunity is the person who is not metabolically very healthy, who thinks they need to drink a liter of Gatorade an hour. And no, actually, that person can absolutely be on a carbohydrate-restricted diet, and they can exercise. And yes, maybe their performance initially is less than what it would be if they still mainlined all the carbohydrates in the world. But in the long run, they're going to produce a much more metabolically healthy phenotype, even though they won't be in the top 0.1% of athletes who will.
No, exactly. I agree. And the thing with the elite athletes, too, is that, yes, and this is kind of what I keep bringing up all the time, there's no population on Earth who has as many carbohydrates and simple sugars as these athletes by a landslide, right? These guys at the Tour de France, for example.
Yeah, tell people, let's take a long stage of the tour. So a 250-kilometer stage that has, say, 4 high category climbs and 1 HC climb. So 1 climb beyond category.
Yeah, so these people, they take...
First of all, how long would it take them to complete 250-kilometer stage with 4 high category and 1 non-category, which means it's just a brutal climb?
Yeah, it would be more like a 200, and it would be like a 5.5 hours.
And how long would that take you or I to ride right now?
Man, that would take us 2 hours more easily.
Yeah, and how long would it take...
or an hour and a half. Or
take me 2 hours more if I'm lucky. How long would that take a person who doesn't ride their bike much?
2 days.
Yeah.
I mean, 14 hours, something like that, because they will have to do multiple stops.
And at the HC, they might not even make the climb.
Yeah. Or much slower. Yeah. While they do these climbs at the Tour de France, it depends on the weight, but usually they go between 6 and 6.5 watts per kilogram. Let's say a person of 70 kilos, which is...
70 kilos is probably
154 pounds. So that would be about, 420, 450 watts. So we cannot do that. Like a normal, well-trained person who exercises regularly can maybe do that in 300 watts. But a person who doesn't train can do that in 150 watts only. So that's a long, long time.
And their weight is usually significantly higher when they climb.
Exactly.
So that day, it's hard to believe they can do that in 5 to 6 hours, by the way, but they would consume how much on that day, both on the bike and off the bike?
So normally what they do, and I haven't published this, but we keep track of this all the time. We keep track of the amount of carbohydrates per hour. We keep track of the breakfast, what they eat on the bike, after the bike, recovery. Right away, we have these protocols. And these protocols are very up to what they need or what we think they need, and also based on what their demands are, because they're the ones who they need it, And again, as I said earlier, I've seen athletes even restricting carbohydrates in the races, and they get totally destroyed. So these guys, they consume a total of about 12 grams per kilogram of body weight per day of carbohydrates. So if you're 155 pounds, which could be an average weight, let's say 70 kilos, we're talking about close to 150 grams a day of carbohydrates.
More than 150. You said how much? 12?
850.
850. Yeah. Sorry, I thought you said 150. Okay.
Which is 850 grams of carbohydrates.
That's that's almost 4,000 calories of carbs
3,500
right there.
calories of carbs. And out of those, at least a good 30% of those to 50 is simple carbohydrates. Let's say 30% of those. So we're talking about these people are having daily about 1,500 grams of sugar. 1,500 calories of sugar. So almost...
Give me an example of what type of sugar they're consuming, like gels and goos.
Yeah, the gels, the goos, the drinks, and then obviously at breakfast, at lunch and dinner, they're more complex. But during the race, in the first part, we do more solid versus liquid, but towards the end of the race, we do more liquid, so more pure sugar, simply because it's absorbed faster. And that's why you need more energy. But yeah, these people, again, they do about 1,500 calories a day just in sugar. Imagine pretty much your entire daily caloric intake of a normal person, a bowl of sugar. If you want to do this, if you go to a nutritionist and you say, I want to do this,
look,
they will shoot you.
If I did that, I'd have diabetes in a month.
Of course. And we know that they don't have it. In fact, this is the healthiest metabolically population in the planet.
Now, the irony of it is on twofold. One, in many other ways, they're wildly unhealthy. The rate of catabolism, the bone density loss that these guys experience over the Tour de France is debilitating. I mean, these guys, they lose so much muscle, they lose so much bone density. The other thing we see is, for many of these athletes, the transition out of being at that level to being normal, civilian again is devastating. Yeah. Because especially, I actually read an article on this once. I wonder if I could find it. I believe that the answer was more common in males than females, where the rebound effect to becoming metabolically unhealthy was unbelievable. It's very hard to turn that spigot off of you're basically a nonstop eating machine, and then all of a sudden you're on the path to having diabetes 3 years, 5 years, 10 years after being the fittest person in the world.
Yeah, and that happened to me when I quit cycling. Between school, work, I was working and traveling. I was working 70 hours a week at least. I was from doing 500 kilometers a week to do 500 kilometers a year. I would exercise literally 6-7 times a year and traveling and eating. And one thing that I have observed is like insulin sensitivity. These athletes have the highest insulin sensitivity of any humans as well. There's no insulin resistance because first, we know very well that exercise increases insulin sensitivity, and the need to utilize carbohydrates, it increases insulin sensitivity as well, and the transporters.
There's all that efficiency in the mitochondria comes with another benefit, which we didn't really talk about, which was non-insulin dependent glucose uptake is also going up. So now if you take a normal person, we are able to take up glucose with insulin. That's the insulin sensitivity. But we have a second door that doesn't get utilized much, which is the non-insulin requiring door to put glucose in the muscle. And there's no better way to stimulate that than zone 2. I mean, I don't know if I have a study that I can point to, but I can clinically tell you without a shadow of a doubt, and I'll tell you how I know. It's looking at people with type 1 diabetes.
Exactly. I was going to mention that.
Yeah, you take people for whom you know exactly how much insulin they require. I'm actually going to be writing about one of these patients in my book. He's type 1 diabetes, completely dependent on insulin. He's completely maniacal. I love him. 3-hour brisk walk every night. So that's his zone 2. 3 hours of zone 2 a day. Brutal. Right? You know how much insulin this person with type 1 diabetes requires a day?
2.5 in units.
About 8 to 10 units a day. He has the highest sex hormone binding globulin I've ever seen in a human being, which is inversely proportionate to insulin level. This guy has no insulin. He doesn't require any.
I learned from this a lot. I was working with Team Novo Nordisk.
Yeah. Tell people about what Team Novo Nordisk is.
So Team Novo Nordisk is a professional team where 100% of the cyclists are type 1 diabetics.
These are professional cyclists with type 1 diabetes.
So the whole purpose of Team Novo Nordisk was first to show the world that you're not going to not only not die if you have type 1 diabetes, but you can become a professional athlete. To spread the word, because a lot of people think it's a devastating diagnosis for many. Oh, you're type 1. You're going to die soon. And like, no, you're not going to die soon if you take good care of yourself, and even you can become a professional athlete. So that was the one message to spread the word. And the second is that to study diabetes and type 1 diabetes and the metabolic effects of exercise, because nowadays, most endocrinologists working with diabetics, they're telling to exercise. The problem is like they go to exercise and they have many hypoglycemias or hyperglycemias, and they need to correct it. And all the hormonal system goes all over the map. And they go back to their doctors and they have no answers. So it's the number one barrier that they find from exercise. And many decide not to exercise because they can control their doses very well at home.
And let's explain why that's happening to people. We've talked a lot about the consumption of glucose, but as you're alluding to, whether it's you, me, or someone with type 1 diabetes, when I exercise very strenuously, my glucose goes way up. So if I'm doing twice a week, I do high intensity exercise. As you can see on my arm, I wear a continuous glucose meter. It's not uncommon, especially if I do it right after a zone 2. This is funny because zone 2, my glucose steadily falls. Let's say I get on the bike at 100. I do 45 minutes of zone 2. I get off at 75.
You get to bonk sometimes, even. I
don't go long enough to bonk for sure. So then, let's say I get on the air bike and I do a 4-minute protocol. It's not uncommon for me to go from 75 to 160 because of the hepatic glucose output.
Yeah, glycogenolysis, yeah.
And that person with type 1 diabetes, that number could easily be 250 because they don't have the insulin to correct it.
Exactly. So then they need to correct it and they freak out. So they use a lot of insulin.
They overshoot it.
Exactly. They overshoot it. And this is exactly to what you pointed out about the non-insulin dependent system, which is the muscle. And this is what it was an educational process. So then with JDRF, the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation, that they put together like a group of experts, if you will, to train clinicians about this.
So what did you learn? I mean, how do people compete in professional cycling without being on that glycemic roller coaster?
So we learned a lot to work on insulin usage as opposed to insulin correction. And that's what we're taking now to the clinical space, because type 1 diabetes has been about correcting insulin and eating carbohydrates. Oh, you go low. Sorry, man. It's just keep eating candy or things like that. And we know that that cannot be very healthy for you in the long term. But the approach has been always that, to correct by either eating or using insulin. But we're trying to really correct it by really tackling insulin administration.
So using just longer acting forms, is that
either you're longer acting or less insulin, and therefore also to do exercise. So when you do exercise, as you say, first your insulin sensitivity increases, so you don't need so much insulin. And as I said earlier, the first tissue that develops type 2 diabetes or insulin resistance is the skeletal muscle. So when you eat carbohydrates, the big percentage of that are going to go into your skeletal muscle.
Are people with type 1 diabetes who are exercising even more insulin sensitive at the muscle than non-insulin dependent individuals who are matched?
They could probably be. So the long-term exposure. This is what I observed, for example, about glycogen. Unfortunately, it wasn't published because the N was very low. But the reviewers, they didn't understand that you cannot do muscle biopsies to a professional cycling team. And there's only one professional cycling team in the world. So I did the Tour of Colorado. I did the Team Novo Nordisk and another team, and I looked at the glycogen.
What did you see?
About 25% higher glycogen content before the race and after the race in type 1 diabetics. And about 3 times less carbohydrate needs than the non-diabetics, which we already had seen because we count carbohydrates. And we know that a normal cyclist, they have 20 grams per hour of carbohydrates. They're going to hit the wall in a race. Type 1 diabetics, they have 20, 25 average, and they never have any issues.
You must see higher free fatty acid levels then.
Yes.
So all things equal, do they just have higher fat oxidation across the entire spectrum?
They're not very good necessarily at that. And I'm trying to understand that puzzle, but what I believe is like they have a higher glycogen content because insulin drives glycogen synthesis, is the main hormone behind glycogen synthesis. So if you've been and the issue of people with type 1 diabetes, they go from a non-physiological state, which is not producing insulin, to the exact opposite. They use a lot more insulin than normal people over years. So 20 years using insulin, it must maybe elicit some adaptations that one of them could be increased glycogen synthesis. I have no idea, but that was kind of what we would like to explore further.
So do you think that those athletes who were able to get by with as little as 20 grams of glucose per hour, which seems impossible to imagine given their energy requirement, do you think at some point that would cease to be the case? And in the Tour of Colorado, maybe the longest stage is 4 or 5 hours?
Yeah.
But still, that's hard to explain. It's still a week-long race, isn't it?
Yeah.
Did you say that their glycogen levels still were 25% higher at the end of the race?
Before and after, yes.
That's counterintuitive.
Yeah.
Sorry, I know it's 25% higher than the non-diabetic, but what about relative to themselves?
They decreased.
How much do they decrease?
I don't remember, because not a whole lot, because, in this stage, you have to do it within the same time. And in the Tour of Colorado, in the mountains, one hotel is here, the other one is 20 minutes away. So I had to do it in one stage where all of them were on the same floor. 2 teams. That was a short stage. It was like 2.5 hour stage. So they eat normally and they decrease like 20% or something like that. So they didn't deplete completely by no means.
You could make the case that team had some of the highest levels of non-insulin dependent glucose uptake you've probably ever measured.
Probably. Yeah. So that's what, to your question of that, the non-insulin uptake of glucose by the skeletal muscle, that's what it's a great approach.
We don't have a way to measure this in those of us who don't have type 1 diabetes.
Yeah.
We're sort of taking a leap of faith that the more we work on our mitochondrial efficiency, the more we will drive that non-insulin dependent pathway. But really, it's only the person in type 1 diabetes where that can be quantified.
And it's a skeletal muscle contraction. First of all, in insulin, what it does, it initiates the cascade of events that translocate the transporters of insulin, called the GLUT4s, to the surface of the muscle. GLUT4, to the surface of the muscle. And those transporters are stimulated by insulin. So skeletal muscle does the exact same action. It translocates those GLUT4s to the surface. So therefore, there's the non-insulin dependent.
And why does exercise increase that ability?
We don't know the exact mechanisms.
It just seems too good to be true. I want to make sure that the person listening to this understands what you just said. So I'm just going to repeat it because it's so profound. And you said it like sort of, you said it sort of like matter-of-factly because, of course, for you, it's common knowledge. When insulin hits the insulin receptor on a muscle, it sends a cascade of chemical reactions inside the muscle that ultimately results in a tube called the GLUT4 transporter being raised to the surface of the muscle and translocating across the membrane. And now you have by passive diffusion, glucose can enter the muscle. The key is this insulin. In the lock is the insulin receptor, and the downstream effect that occurs inside the house opens the door and lets the glucose in. What you said after that is you explained how non-insulin dependent glucose works, which is somehow just the contraction of the muscle. So something that's going on inside the house squeezes, and out comes the same beautiful GLUT4 transporter, which now allows the same passive diffusion of glucose into the cell, but this time it didn't require insulin. This is the best of both worlds.
This is what Henry Richer from Denmark and Laurie Goodyear from Harvard, they've been dedicating many years to study these pathways. So they found that this muscle contraction stimulates these pathways to translocate those GLUT4 transporters to the surface. And this is why the pancreas in regular people who don't have type 1 diabetes decreases insulin secretion about 50% during exercise, because the muscle, they do the rest. And this is what causes also that hypoglycemia in athletes. If they don't correct their insulin before exercise, they go hypo. So what we were doing, and now we're doing clinically, we're telling people to reduce the dose.
Wait a minute, this is interesting now. This is suggesting that the reduction that I'm seeing in glucose when I do my zone 2, which is by far the most profound thing. You don't see this at higher levels of intensity.
You see the opposite.
You see the opposite, your glucose going up. But zone 2 is a sweet spot where my glucose level always falls precipitously. I shouldn't say precipitously, steadily and consistently. I never thought of it this way. It must be almost entirely the non-insulin-dependent glucose uptake, because it's a low enough level of intensity that my internal glycogen stores are easily providing
glucose,
what is needed.
Yes.
So this is an additional amount through that. So I feel like this is another metric I want to start keeping track of each day I'm doing zone 2. It's not just power, it's not just heart rate, it's not just lactate, it's the delta in glucose from start to finish could be yet another metric we look at.
And in fact, one of the things is like I'm trying to take this to the clinic for people with type 2 diabetes is like if you eat, go exercise right away. Because when you exercise right away, that muscle contraction is going to translocate these GLUT4 transporters without the need of insulin.
And I thought it was the opposite. I thought that exercising will increase the insulin-dependent portion, and therefore the best time for someone with diabetes to eat was right after exercise. It could be both.
It could be both, yes. I think that might be on a patient-by-patient base. But if you have insulin resistance, you're going to need to use more insulin after you eat, which it's a patch. It doesn't solve the problem. But if you exercise, then you might need half of the insulin because the other half is going to be provided of the glucose intake into the cell by the muscle contraction. So learning a lot from type 1 diabetics, we can apply things to type 2, I believe. One of the things that we see the opposite effect that we saw in the races, normal people who are told to exercise, they're not fit enough, and they start jogging, right? And they're in zone 4 already, very glycolytic. They see the opposite. They see in the post-exercise hyperglycemia, where they're, as you said, in the 260s. So, and they inject themselves insulin and they go down, and sometimes in the middle of the night, and then they go home. If it's towards the evening, they eat and they correct it again, and sometimes end up in the ER because they have a severe hypoglycemia. But so one of the things that I started to apply first to the cyclists and then to patients is the cool down. So after people would have this post-exercise hyperglycemia, the muscle contraction stops. And that's why I believe this is why it is happening. First, you have a very high adrenergic activity, high intensity, a lot of adrenaline, and that's what causes the breakdown of glycogen into glucose, as well as the glucose export from the
liver,
from the liver. But then when you stop, that muscle contraction stops completely. So you don't have that.
You've taken away one of your sinks.
Exactly. So that's when you start doing the cool down. And that's another study. I have the data I have to publish, but we could see clearly that everybody started to go down.
There's definitely going to be some University of Colorado medical students or
hopefully
undergraduates who have just lined up potentially a half a dozen interesting things to write with you.
We started to see the cool down, and the cool down would take care of it. So people to the point that they would not need insulin anymore to correct it, whereas before they might need 3, 4, 5 units. And now they don't need it anymore because that cool down took care of it. So through JDRF, we've been traveling throughout the country and other places in Europe and even Australia, training clinicians about this so they can go back to their patients. And the cool down has been a basic thing, and the feedback we're getting is awesome.
This is incredible. It's such a shame that the disease type 1 diabetes and the disease type 2 diabetes share the same name in diabetes, because I do think for many people, they just sort of think someone has diabetes, but the nomenclature of 1 versus 2 is profound. They are really different diseases.
They're completely different.
They almost have nothing in common except for high glucose as a potential consequence.
I agree 100%.
It's a real shame. There's an artifact of history.
And this is what I'm trying to also bring the concept of double diabetes, that very few people talk about it because it's mixed. Type 2 diabetics, especially now in the US, Novo Nordisk told me that I think about 2/3 of the entire insulin that is sold in America is for type 2s, not for type 1s. And this is the animal that is different. The type 2 diabetic people is a way different animal than it was 50 years ago.
I've always been sort of critical of these companies like Novo Nordisk because I feel like there's just too great a conflict of interest for them, right? I mean, first of all, insulin should be basically free. There's absolutely no, from an IP perspective, there's absolutely no reason insulin should cost anything above some nominal amount. So it's this cash cow for drug companies like Novo Nordisk. Don't worry, I'm not going to put you on the spot and have you speak critically at all. I'm going to do all the critical speaking.
Yeah, no, because we get funded. This group is funded by Novo Nordisk, the JDRF.
Indirectly, what I'm going to do is come around and sort of pay them this compliment and say, I like realizing that there's something good that's done by an entity that I generally view not favorably. Because again, one, the price gouging on insulin to me is the most unethical part of pharma. But then on top of that, there's this issue of 2/3 of your sales come from a patient who shouldn't be using your drug. The drug really is for people with type 1 diabetes. If you have type 2 diabetes, almost without exception, changing the way you eat and exercise will at least get rid of the insulin requirement. You may still require other medications, but you shouldn't require insulin. And that's been repeatedly demonstrated. So all that said, rant over, it's nice to see that this type of research is being done because these patients offer us a beautiful physiologic milieu in which you otherwise couldn't see this. So this kind of brings me to, while we're on the topic of diabetes, something else that I want to talk with you about, which is my recent, and by recent I mean over the last 6 months, frankly, maybe 9 months, sort of back and forth exploration of my use of metformin. When we very first time met a year ago, we talked about how I use metformin. I've been using it for years with the basic belief that even though I don't have diabetes or insulin resistance, it offers some measure of protection from cardiometabolic disease, inclusive of cancer. And that's all based on data that unfortunately is confined to people with insulin resistance, hyperinsulinemia, or type 2 diabetes. So there was always a leap of faith I was taking that if you took a metabolically healthy individual, they would still have some benefit. And when patients would ask me about it, I would say, my belief is that I'm probably receiving less benefit than someone who's more metabolically unhealthy, but I think I'm receiving benefit and I don't see a downside. And then all of that changed a year ago when we met and I started keeping track of my zone 2 numbers. And what I immediately realized was a gross mismatch between where I knew physiologically I was clearly in a zone 2 just based on perceived effort and my understanding of my fitness level, but I couldn't get over how high my lactate levels were. And then I remember you and I would speak and you would say, well, what is your lactate level fasting? And I'd say, sometimes it's like 1.6. Even before I start, this was back when I was in the business of using as many strips as possible. They're so expensive, those stupid things. So I would check 2 times fasting and then every 10 minutes check double.
Man.
And there was no denying it. My lactate levels were through the roof. And I said to you, do you think it could be the metformin? And then around this time, a couple of papers came out that suggested that metformin could be blunting the benefits of exercise. So, I mean, let's go back to then, and then we'll talk about where we are today in our thinking. But at the time that I told you all of this, what was your thinking about my use of metformin and these numbers we were seeing? Did it make sense to you?
Yeah, they make sense in a way that we know that I've seen patients with metformin, pre-type 2 diabetic or type 2 diabetic right before entering insulin states, where at rest I have even seen 2 millimoles also.
Are you able to differentiate how much of that was due to the metformin versus because there's such a confounder when you look at that population? Had you seen anybody like me where they're...
No, I've seen these high levels of lactate at rest, but again, I could not differentiate that, but all these people coincided they were on metformin. One of the side effects of metformin is lactic acidosis, right? It's rare, but it can happen. So we know there's something wrong with the lactate. What we don't know are the mechanisms. It would be great to study the mechanisms, whether are to improve the cardiometabolic health, or maybe we might find that might not be what we thought. We know there are some studies that show that metformin decreases mitochondrial function and could be that magical drug against cancer. Because one of the things that we see in cancer, many forms of cancer, they have a mitochondrial dysfunction, yet not enough for that cancer cell to be apoptotic.
Oh, I see. So you're saying that maybe in that patient, metformin pushes them over the edge towards apoptosis.
Towards the cliff. That's what I believe, if in case that is true, that metformin can cause mitochondrial dysfunction. But the fact that the metformin increases lactate, it's either because it increases the glucose flux into the cell and saturates PDH, and then PDH dehydrogenase has a very, what we call low Michaelis constant, so it saturates very rapid. And in my opinion, acts as a fuse in the body. From an evolutionary perspective, if the body sees there's a lot of high flux of glucose, the body might mean, hey, what's going on here? We need to stop it because it's not good to become hypoglycemic. And maybe the majority of those glycolytic enzymes in the downstream action of glycolysis, they usually have a high Michaelis constant. But when they get to PDH, it's like a fuse. So when that fuse goes, then pyruvate is converted to lactate. So that could be, it's either increases the flux of glucose into the cell, and that's why it could work well for diabetes, or acts as others have shown.
This is very interesting. So this suggests that, let's just talk for a moment about someone with type 2 diabetes who's not taking metformin. Their lactate levels are higher at baseline. You're now really offering 2 explanations for it. The first is PDH, because their PDH is seeing higher glucose than the non-diabetic. So that's the first thing it's doing is, as you say, I like that analogy of the fuse. It's just triggering the fuse and shunting more glucose down the pyruvate to lactate pathway. And then, of course, there's everything we spent the first hour talking about, which is, in addition to that, their mitochondria just tap out very early. They're not working well. So those 2 things that are related but quite distinct would both push up lactate. So now the question is, which one of those is more likely being driven by metformin? Is it the inhibition of complex 2 in the mitochondria, and it's simply reducing mitochondrial efficiency? If you picture a curve where the x-axis is mitochondrial function, it's just moving you to the left.
Exactly. It could be that, and maybe
it
could be both. What we know, epidemiologically speaking, is that metformin doesn't cure diabetes. And the immense majority of patients, they end up using insulin down the road. So we know that metformin is not that magical drug for type 2 diabetics. It just kind of gets them by. It buys them time. But eventually the majority enter insulin. If they don't change their lifestyle, their nutrition, exercise, they enter insulin. So why?
So the first thing I did, I used to take 1 gram twice a day, a gram in the morning and a gram before bed. I always do my zone 2 first thing in the morning. So I was basically doing a zone 2 right after taking a gram and basically 12 hours after having taken another gram. So you could argue I had very high levels. So I think the first change I made was I just stopped taking a gram in the morning and increased my nighttime dose to 1,500 milligrams. So I reduced my overall dose by 25%, but shifted it to the nighttime, thinking, well, I should have a lower concentration in my bloodstream in the morning. I saw no meaningful effect. So 1,500 at night was still producing basically the same effect as a gram twice a day. Now, again, keep in mind when you're doing an N of 1, you can't actually make any statistics out of this. It has to be a big signal for me to notice it. So then I lowered it to a nighttime dose of 1 gram. I still didn't really see much of a difference. And then what I did is I stopped taking it the night before doing zone 2. So that meant I now went from taking 14 grams a week, a gram twice a day, to only 1 gram 3 nights a week, because there's only 3 nights a week where I don't follow the workout by a zone 2. So you've gone from taking 14 grams a week to 3 grams per week. You could argue, why are you taking any of it at that point? And that's when I saw the reduction. That's when I saw the lactate levels start to come down.
Okay.
And in fact, that latter part of the experiment's only been going on for about 3 weeks. So the next step is to stop metformin altogether and ride this out, which makes me think we should do a little experiment in me, which is, we should do muscle biopsies, complete proteomics, complete metabolomics, everything that is doable in vitro in the muscle tissue, along with the lactate testing and all the other metrics under 3 states of physiology. 1, under full dose of metformin. 2, under a complete washout, say 30 days of no metformin. And then the third one I'd think would be very interesting is under complete water fast, where I also, by the way, whenever I water fast, I have no metformin. And I'd like to see what 7 days of water fasting with no metformin looks like versus, again, these other 2 states. So I think there's an interesting pilot study here.
You should come to our study and be part of it, and we can do extra biopsies.
Yeah. I'm totally game to do this.
Yeah, it would be very interesting because it's fascinating the whole role of metformin and also how it can be used in other diseases as well. And it's fascinating the little that we know about the mechanisms of action at the molecular level yet. I think you bring a great point, is to try metformin in different states and try to learn what happens at the mix level, metabolomics, proteomics level, especially the latter ones. Because, we might see pathways. Maybe it's a mitochondrial dysfunction that causes that, and we can see that quite well. Or maybe it's at the translocational level of the transporters.
And it would be really interesting, assuming the IRB gives a quick approval for this little added protocol that includes me, if we could recruit somebody with type 2 diabetes and have them parallel me without the metformin, without the fast. Because my new hypothesis around metformin is, I just have a stronger conviction, I think, around my old hypothesis, which is the healthier you are, the less helpful it is. I'm now wondering if it goes one step further, which is the healthier you are, the less, it might actually cease to be healthy. In other words, let's take the extreme example. What would you predict would happen if you gave a Tour de France team a gram of metformin twice a day during the tour? No other change. You just give them a gram of metformin throughout the tour. Do you think it would have no impact on performance or a negative impact?
Based on looking at that, it can affect mitochondrial function. And we see, because there's increased lactate, in my opinion, and that's the very first take, and by no means I'm an expert on this, it might be detrimental. That's my first take.
If you think you had a hard time getting professional cyclists to volunteer for muscle biopsies, think about how much harder it'll get them to volunteer for the take metformin and go off and do the Vuelta.
I know. It would be really, really difficult to get IRB for that in the first place. and the permission
Destroy
from the
someone's
manager.
livelihood.
Yeah.
There's so much more I want to talk about.
And I want to talk real quick that the double diabetes, I forgot, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, is that's something that worries me, because there are many people with type 1 who also have type 2, and they're not diagnosed. And I think we need to raise the awareness, because if about 50% of U.S. adult population has type 2 diabetes, a big number of people with type 1 diabetes are going to have also type 2.
Is that a projection of how many people in the United States will have type 2 diabetes?
Right now, about 50% of U.S. adult population have either pre-diabetes or diabetes.
Correct, yeah. And it's about, is it maybe 10% have type 2 diabetes and the remaining 40% is pre-diabetes?
Yeah. And I was thinking there's not such state as being pre-pregnant or pregnant. You're pregnant or you're not. So, the pre-type 2 diabetes wouldn't see clinical symptoms yet, but the disease is there already. Yeah,
it's just, our definition of diabetes is so arbitrary and stupid that it's just a continuum, and we somehow decide, your hemoglobin A1C crossed this threshold.
And now you need or not. It's kind of like with the same thing with cholesterol. Oh, you're 200, boom, you need a statin, or 220, you need a statin. On that note, that's the other thing with statins, is that we know that they affect mitochondrial function.
How do we see this? Because in the published literature, 5 to 10% of people experience muscle symptoms from statins. But what is the functional impact?
The functional impact, we don't know much about it.
So you're talking outside of myalgias and muscle pain. The good news is, I always say this to patients when you're taking a statin, you're going to get the feedback very quick. 1 in 10 of you is not going to tolerate this, and it won't be very subtle, and you'll stop the medication, and within a week, you'll feel better. And again, what's interesting is the disparate data based on how it's studied. But at the individual level, it's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, it is pretty straightforward. And one thing that we know, too, is that it increases also, and there's research done, it increases the possibilities of becoming diabetic.
Yeah, so that's the 2 things I usually say to a patient. I said, because everyone says, look, if you're going to do a statin, what are the risks? And I say, the short-term risk is myalgias. And again, I just say directionally, it's 1 in 10 people. Maybe it's 15%, maybe it's 5%. But you get the feedback quickly and you move on. So the second risk is a long-term risk, which is about a 4% increase in the risk of diabetes. The good news there is that's not a sudden thing. I think the literature is still pretty clear